Thanks, Count Corley. We are in the middle of the greatest housing crisis in generations. We have 10,000 people officially homeless, despite all the efforts of the government to keep the figures artificially low. You have over 100,000 people on housing waiting lists. There's 500,000 young people stuck in their parents' houses because of being unable to afford rent. You've hundreds of thousands more faced with rent that is completely out of control, and hundreds of thousands more than that again unable to buy their first home. You wouldn't know any of that to listen to Minister Donoghue. He told us with pride at 1 o'clock this afternoon that, quote, in the last 12 months, 5,000 households have exited homelessness. What he neglected to tell us is that more than 5,000 households in the same period of time entered homelessness, with the result that the number of households that are homeless rose rather than declined. And in the midst of this greatest housing crisis, what we have presented before us, proposed by Fine Gael, and what will be agreed by Fianna Fáil, despite all their empty calls for this to be a housing budget, is we have a landlord's budget. We have a landlord's budget presented by a landlord's minister on behalf of a landlord's government, with more tax reliefs for landlords who are making unprecedented profits, the highest in the EU, with more HAP money being shovelled in the direction of the landlords, and the government simply repackaging the same old Rebuilding Ireland promises and figures one more time. Minister Owen Murphy, in the debate last week, reassured us that he had no ideological position on housing. And then a week later, we have a budget that absolutely confirms that the ideological position of the government, of those that Minister Halligan is in government with, Fine Gael, the Independents and so on, have an ideological position. It's a right-wing ideological position. It's a free market ideological position. It's a neoliberal ideological position. And it's an ideological position which chimes with the material interests of those who support Fine Gael, the landlords and the developers. And what we know from the budget, of course, is that that ideological position doesn't exist in a vacuum just on the issue of housing. It relates to their entire view of how the economy should be run. And that view of how the economy should be run, those neoliberal policies carried out in the years of crisis and carried out in the years of supposed recovery, have resulted in a society with entrenched deep inequality, where there has been a very substantial recovery for the tops, for the top 300 people who have doubled their personal wealth over the last number of years, for the corporations who have doubled their profits over the last number of years, but where the consequence, in the context of workers' wages being barely at the point that they were now pre-crisis, is that the wealth has funneled upwards at an unprecedented rate, and where 10% of the population now control 54% of the net wealth, leaving just 5% for the bottom 50%. A shift in society from wages to profits, with workers' wages falling as a percentage of GDP from 53% in 2008 to 40% at the now. And this is a budget to entrench that neoliberal model and that inequality which flows from it. We have a budget here which is a budget for fiddling while the whole world burns, with effectively nothing to say on the key issue of climate change, where yesterday's IPCC report, which has the whole world talking about the fact that we have 12 years to turn the situation around to avoid hitting 1.5 degrees. It doesn't seem to have performed any wake-up service for the government whatsoever. It's a budget for the continuation of discrimination and mistreatment of young people, of students, of young workers, and of the young unemployed. It's a budget which, in terms of taxation, gives less than a fiver to an average worker and then turns a very encouraging blind eye to the multinationals to continue their tax avoidance on a massive, massive scale while the government pretends to be doing something about it, but the figures demonstrate that's not the case. There was an alternative, there is an alternative, but it's based on the implementation of radically different policies than those of the government. It's based on the implementation of socialist policies to use the resources that exist in our society to tackle the housing emergency now, to invest in public services, and to use public investment and democratic public ownership to sustainably develop economically and environmentally our economy. But right-wing parties and the big parties in this Dáil are never going to implement such a programme. It requires a mass movement outside the Dáil and the building of a mass socialist left. And last week, I thought, was a very important moment, with 10,000 people midweek on the streets for the Raise the Roof protest. Apparently, it wasn't just the left which saw the significance of that protest. It was reported by various journalists that the right-wing TDs in here were worried that it seemed it wasn't just the usual suspects out protesting. Well, if you create a situation where most of the population are affected by a housing crisis, be prepared that they are going to, at a certain stage, have had enough, and they're going to mobilise to try to say that they need policies to resolve that crisis. But I would also say now to the government that if you thought that was bad last Wednesday, that this budget is a red rag to a bull in terms of the housing movement that is now developing, because this budget shows that the government has no intention of taking the action that is necessary to deal with the housing crisis. This budget, and Fianna Fáil's effective agreement to it, indicates that Fianna Fáil's vote last week for a motion was a joke, that they never meant it, and that they share the same viewpoint of Fine Gael. And so be prepared. A Saturday, it was so dishonest of Fianna Fáil to vote for a motion last week calling for an increase at a minimum of €1 billion to be spent on housing in this budget, and then to come in the next week and to agree with Fine Gael a budget which doesn't contain anything like that. And so be prepared for a massive Saturday protest to take place in the coming weeks. A protest that will have as its target the government, but also Fianna Fáil, who together in reality make up the majority for this government, and the Independent Alliance, of course, and we wouldn't let you away with that. But also be prepared for a new wave of housing occupations, as the activists involved in Take Back the City and those inspired by it, which have given new impetus to the housing movement that we saw with 10,000 out on the streets, again take action to highlight the vacant housing and the resources that exist in our society that are not being used. That's what's necessary. And it's necessary because the position from the government and Fianna Fáil on housing is absolutely clear from this budget. You remain completely wedded to the idea of incentivising the private market to provide housing. A massive transfer of wealth to private landlords through HAP, an additional 120 million provided for in this budget. That's the equivalent of 700 public homes on public land every single year. The extra costs of, and the government likes to pretend that they're prudent and so on and gives out that we're not prudent, but the incredible extra costs of pursuing such an ideological approach, a right-wing ideological approach to the delivery of housing, of just paying landlords and then saying that people's housing needs are met, and saying that of the 70,000 social housing that they're talking about, 50,000 of it in reality is just paying private landlords. But the extra cost is absolutely incredible. The figures provided by drawn from Mel Reynolds' research, and Rory Hearn did work on it, showed that providing 120,000 social housing units through HAP would be €33 billion more expensive than direct local authority provision over a 30-year period. $1 billion a year being wasted, but not just being thrown away nowhere, being transferred to these private landlords. So 120 million extra in HAP, and then €18 million extra in the mortgage interest relief, a total of 120 million. They're again equivalent to 700 public homes on public land. And exactly as Deputy Boyd Barrett pointed out, that this money is available in respect of loans used to purchase, improve or repair their residential property. And anyone who has been in rental accommodation and suffered the disastrous situation of being kicked out of their rental property, in reality so a landlord can hike up the rent, but under the guise of substantial renovations in order to do it, will be absolutely sickened to know that their money, public money, is going to incentivise landlords, it's going to pay them to go and do precisely that, to say that they're doing renovations, to borrow to do renovations, then for the public to pay for those renovations effectively, and then people find themselves homeless yet again. Your approach is not to say that there should be rent controls in a situation where you have a 7% rental yield, double that of Germany or the UK. No, the approach of the government is to shovel yet more money in the direction of the landlords. And even by the most optimistic, most generous interpretation in terms of the figures being put forward in terms of the building of social housing, at very most you're talking about an increase of 5%. An increase of 5% when we have this massive crisis, and as has been pointed out, all of the previous targets in any case have been missed, and so we have very serious questions over whether they would be hit this time. There's an attempt to outsource responsibility for housing, to effectively privatise what is deemed to be social housing in terms of the use of HAP and so on, but also to outsource responsibility to the local authorities and to say to the local authorities, well, they just simply need to build the houses. Well, Minister, I sat in the gallery in South Dublin County Council yesterday. Minister Coveney came out to that council about 2 years ago and he said, money's no object to building social housing. But yesterday, Fine Gael councillors, Fianna Fáil councillors, Labour councillors voted together to effectively privatise 70% of public council land at Kilcarbery. Land that could have provided close to 1,000 social and genuinely affordable homes, instead only providing 300. So your parties bear responsibility for this, centrally, but also locally. The answer to the housing crisis is simple. And you simply cannot say anymore, oh well, it can't be done overnight, or oh well, it can't be done in 7 years. Because you're refusing now to even implement plans that would have an impact in 3 or 4 years' time. So it's not a question of, oh, we can't magic up houses overnight, because you're refusing to invest even now, even at this extremely late stage, in building the homes that are necessary, in building 20,000 new public and affordable homes a year over 5 years to deliver 100,000 new homes to resolve the crisis. And you refuse to do it precisely because of your ideological and material commitment to the market and those who benefit from the market. The Rainy Day Fund, I think, has been a subject of an amount of discussion out there. This is obviously the 3rd year that it's featured in the budget. But each year it comes, it's more and more of a sick joke, because there is a tidal wave of homelessness out there. There is a flood of social problems. It is a monsoon season in terms of inequality. And yet the government doesn't hear, doesn't listen, doesn't want to know about any of that. Instead, they want to put away an additional 500 million euros this year. It just demonstrates how utterly out of touch you are. But we should also remind everybody what the Rainy Day Fund actually is. Because the EU fiscal rules means that the Rainy Day Fund will not be able to be spent on public services. The only circumstances in which the EU fiscal rules will allow this extra money to be spent that isn't coming in state revenue is in the case of external shocks. What will an external shock look like? I think it looks something a lot like what we saw in 2007, 2008 in terms of a world economic crisis, banking collapses, and the money then being used to bail out banks. And so right now, while we have this immense housing crisis raging, the government is effectively building up a bank bailout fund for future use. Clearly and understandably to a degree, Minister Donoghue had his head elsewhere yesterday and missed the IPCC report, but he shouldn't have missed the Climate Action Network report from a few months ago, saying that Ireland is the second worst in the EU in terms of meeting climate change targets. He shouldn't have missed all of the other IPCC reports which make clear what a disaster we are heading towards. But in case the Minister missed yesterday's report, let me spell it out for you. We only have 12 years to stop global warming going over 1.5 degrees Celsius. Another half degree above that would significantly worsen the risks of drought, floods, extreme heat and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. Deborah Roberts, a co-chair of the Working Group on Impact, said, "It's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment and we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community, and I hope it mobilises people and dents the mood of complacency." Well, I'm sorry, Deborah. While undoubtedly it will mobilise people, and that creates the basis for change, there is no sign of the mood of complacency being dented inside the government. Because what we have in this budget is effectively nothing. A nod to hybrid vehicles, which is really not the solution to climate change. If we want to tackle climate change, if we want Ireland to become a zero net emitter of carbon by 2035 at the latest, if we want a just transition to a zero carbon economy, we need action now, and it has to be radical action. Anything less is just completely insufficient, and instead we have effectively nothing. And it is not in line with the attitudes of people in this country. Look at the Citizens' Assembly, 100% voting for the state to take a lead in tackling climate change, 97% voting for the establishment of a new independent body to ensure climate change is at the centre of policy making, 92% voting that the state should prioritise investment in public transport over road infrastructure. But the government didn't listen to any of that, and that's clear in the budget. We need to slash emissions from the two largest sectors, agriculture and transport. And it's very obvious how we do that in terms of transport. You get people out of private cars and you get them into public transport, be that buses, rail, light rail, etc. That means investing in terms of capital in public transport, and it means making it free, like in the case of Estonia. That's what's needed, and the resources exist to allow us to do it, and it would have a radical impact in terms of carbon emissions. Free public transport only costs slightly more than the money raised by the increase in VAT for the hospitality sector. Then, of course, that has to be added to with a significant increase in the subvention. You could bring it back to 2008 levels and increase it by 33% with 130 million and then capital on top of it. And if the government was serious, as opposed to just providing lip service about climate change, these are the kind of measures that they would be implementing. And if we don't build a movement to force your government and others like it around the world to take the action that is necessary, we are all going to pay a devastating price. Ireland, unfortunately, after this budget, remains no country for young people as a result of the actions of this government and previous governments since the crisis. They are treated in many different areas as second-class citizens, with two-tier employment, two-tier social welfare and a complete absence of the necessary investment in their education. Look at the situation of students. The student contribution charge remains at €3,000 after Labour broke their promises to stop any increase. No talk of getting rid of that. Look at access to education, where almost 95% of school students from Dublin 4 go to university compared to less than 20% from Dublin 17. Nothing in terms of the grant for students. Nothing in terms of the student accommodation crisis, where USI estimates there's a demand for over 25,000 beds. But instead of public student accommodation, students are fleeced by various corporate private landlords. Situation of low-paid workers. Many of young people, of course, are low-paid workers, remains the same. You've increased the minimum wage by 20 cents an hour. That's €8 a week if you're on a 40-hour week, when the average increase in rent last year was €50. It remains more than €2 below the living wage, which itself is an absolute rock-bottom minimum if you want to survive in a city, if you want to pay rent. In the public sector, you have entrenched for years to come the existence of two-tier pay. And you have done nothing again in this budget to end the discrimination against under-26s on social welfare. It's incredible to ask young people to live on just over €100 a week. It's disgusting discrimination, and it leaves them in a very, very difficult, precarious, exposed position. The extremely neoliberal approach of the government is very evident in every single aspect of this budget. A clear reliance on the private market to deal with any possible problem. It's very evident in the areas of childcare and in the areas of health. We should remember that Minister Zappone told us in the Dáil that it is an essential foundation for my pledge to transform our childcare system from one of the most expensive in the world to one of the best. And does what is announced today bring us any closer to one of the best, or does it simply entrench one of the most expensive childcare systems in the world? And the answer is obvious. It entrenches this hugely expensive childcare system, because all we have is an increase of a subsidy to private childcare providers. In many areas of Dublin, the cost of childcare is over €1,400 a month for 2 young children. That's 60% of the median take-home pay of a wage earner over 35. In Dublin city centre, the average price of childcare is 50% of the take-home pay of a minimum wage paid full-time worker. And that's including the subsidy. And the subsidies don't deal with that fundamental issue. And you have a sector that, in terms of working conditions, is racked with low pay, with precarity, with a contract which doesn't go to 40 weeks in the year. And the alternative to subsidising the sector is obvious, but it means breaking with that free market reliance. It means to invest to move Ireland into publicly run and free childcare. The total cost of expanding the capacity through capital investment and in hiring 50,000 childcare workers on decent wages to provide free public childcare, state provided for all, which will be transformative, will be €2.5 billion. The same is true in terms of health, where the Minister now claims that health spending is at a record high, but again neglects to mention the fact that the population has increased and has gotten older, and so a higher budget is needed even just to stand still. The Health Services Capacity Review 2018 looked at demographic changes and projected that there's an immediate need for an extra 1,200 beds now if we were to have a safe percentage rate of occupancy. And the study also projected we need an extra almost 6,000 beds by 2031 to keep up with demographic changes. And there is no way that's going to be met on the basis of the current levels of spending. There's going to be a crisis in the hospitals this winter. The INMO have predicted a war zone in the hospitals, and the government has no credible plan to deal with extra patients. Over the summer and into the autumn, there's been a record high in the number of patients sitting on trolleys, nearly 8,000 this September. And what really gives the game away in terms of the approach of the government to healthcare and more generally to public services is you look where the big percentage increases are. National Treatment Purchase Fund up 36%, €20 million. It's about underfunding public services and then outsourcing to private companies the dealing with the mess that is created. It's an absolutely classic recipe for undermining public services and driving in the direction of privatisation. The alternative and most efficient way to run our health service is to say we need an Irish National Health Service, a single-tier, properly funded, quality public health. But instead of going even in a step in that direction in this budget, the government goes the opposite way towards a privatised health service. Final couple of points in relation to taxation. The government will try to make much out of tax changes which see some workers, average paid workers, getting maybe €4 extra a week, without mentioning that it's just wiped out overnight by the increases in rents. But, you know, the big things that are happening, there's misdirection going on to look over here, look at your €4, look at your €5 that you get, but don't look at the very tops of society and the way they're getting away with paying little or no tax. You look at the recent report for the Controller and Auditor General, which revealed that a quarter of those with wealth of over €50 million paid less than an average PAYE worker in tax. Another 40% paid less than €120,000. And that isn't even the biggest scandal. The biggest scandal is the massive tax avoidance taking place by multinational corporations, actively facilitated by the Irish government. The government keeps claiming and keeps repeating the idea of 12.5%, but the corporations, the big corporations, do not pay 12.5%. The figures are in, you can look at them, they're clear. 2016 total profits before deductions just under 160 billion. Total corporation tax paid just over 7 billion. An effective rate of corporation tax after deductions of 4.5%. And we know that some of the very worst companies in terms of using Ireland as a tax haven conduit are the big technology companies, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks. But the other big participants that have been revealed by a recent report by Oxfam are the big pharmaceutical companies. 4 of the largest, Abbott, Johnson & Johnson, Merck and Pfizer, are using Ireland to avoid paying tax. To take one example, Abbott, it paid no tax whatsoever on profits of €1.2 billion declared in Ireland in 2015. Not a single cent. It's a loss for the public of €155 million from one company for just 1 year. Yet the government still tries to claim that they are tackling tax avoidance. We should be very clear that this is not a victimless crime, or this is not a simple matter of tax competition, which Ireland just happens to be very good at. We live in a world of galloping inequality, where 82% of wealth generated across the world last year went to the richest 1%, with the bottom 50% getting none of it. And a key factor in that inequality is the race to the bottom in corporate tax rates, which Ireland is leading the way in. Ordinary people in this country pay a price in terms of the housing crisis, in terms of health, in terms of education, as a result of not collecting tax from the likes of Apple, Google, Facebook, Abbott, Pfizer, and so on. Developing countries and those who need public services in developing countries pay a price. But it's also a model which is fundamentally unsustainable, given the situation in terms of Brexit, given the situation in terms of Trump, and given the race to the bottom in terms of corporate tax rates that others are engaging in. An alternative model is needed. Just to finish, I'd say that people should be clear that there's a huge amount of wealth in this society. Not only wealth that already sits there, but wealth that is generated on a yearly basis. GDP per person this year, per every single person, is about €60,000. It's loads of wealth in our society. But it's a question of how that wealth is distributed and how the sources of that wealth are owned. A very radical alternative to what is put forward today by the government is possible. But it means breaking from the fiscal straitjacket of the EU rules. It means breaking from the model of capitalism and the reliance on the free market to deliver. It means saying that the interests of society as a whole should come before the interests of the profiteers and the privateers. It means using the wealth in society in a social way to address all of the crises that are present. The wealth exists in our society to tackle the housing crisis, to build a national health service, to provide free public childcare, to provide free public transport, and for a just transition to a zero-carbon economy. But it requires radical socialist policies. Look even at the amounts of wealth that could be raised through taxation alone. A millionaire's tax of 2% would raise over $3 billion. A doubling of the corporate tax rate for big businesses and a cutting of loopholes would raise over $10 billion. Increasing PRSI for employers could raise $1.4 billion. Repudiating odious bankers' debt would be a yearly saving of around $3 billion. And there's many, many, many more examples. Of course, taxation alone is not enough. You cannot control what you do not own, and so we need democratic public ownership of the key sectors of our economy to resolve the crises we face. And when you look concretely at the crises that we face, that's obvious. When you look at the housing crisis, it's obvious to say that we should use the resources that have gone into the Rainy Day Fund, that exist in terms of NAMA, that exist in terms of ISIF, to set up a public construction company to build on public land and build the housing necessary. Or in terms of climate change, where it's obvious that the energy companies need to be taken into democratic public ownership, that the oil and gas should be left in the ground, and in a situation where private companies have refused to make the kind of investment in wind and wave energy which is necessary and which could see Ireland being a leader in terms of green energy. Or in terms of moving away from the disastrous tax haven model that leads absolutely nowhere. It's clear that public investment and public ownership of the key sections of the economy are necessary for a sustainable plan of economic development. None of the major parties here stand for such a programme, but it is what is necessary to resolve the crises facing people in this country, and it's what is possible on the basis of the resources that exist here. This landlord's budget, this neoliberal budget, this anti-young person budget underlines yet again the need to build a mass party of the left to fight for a left government which would introduce a socialist budget and which would really transform people's lives.